All right, Ben Hailey, welcome to the Magnalia podcast.
Thank
Glad
you.
to have you today.
Thank you.
You are a minister in the Presbyterian Church in America, the PCA, like me. Jim is a deacon in the PCA. You have been in campus ministry for a long time, and more recently, you have now planted a church and are pastoring it, and it's humming along. You are also the impetus, the heart, the mind, the passion behind this overture to the PCA's General Assembly, coming now through the South Texas Presbytery, about Bitcoin. Tell us about this overture and what it's aiming to do.
Yeah, so the overture is really a call for sessions, presbyteries, and our denominational agencies and committees to study the wisdom of including Bitcoin on their balance sheets. That's the call for the overture.
Can you explain to people who are not in the PCA, or maybe they're in the PCA but they've forgotten these things, what an overture is, what a presbytery is, what's going on right now, what does this have to do with the denomination, how does it all work?
Yeah, so the way I describe it is it's like a bill or it's like a piece of legislation. There are many different types of overtures that are brought to our annual General Assembly. This particular overture began really kind of in my kitchen, cooking this thing up and just saying, hey, I'd love for our presbytery to consider that, to consider this overture. And so presented it to our administrative committee of our presbytery. Now, what are presbyteries? Presbyteries, I like to tell people, they're kind of like church districts. They're geographical regions, and the membership in that presbytery is the churches, the PCA churches in that geographic region, as well as the teaching elders who are the pastors of those churches. And so I brought this to our quarterly meeting back in January. The administrative committee considered it and chose to bring it to the floor as a recommendation to our presbytery, and the members present are, for example, the teaching elders in that presbytery, plus any ruling elder delegates that have been assigned by those churches. And it passed our presbytery vote, and so now it has been, it was sent to the stated clerk's office of our denomination and posted to the General Assembly website with a list of all the overtures. This is overture number 11. Now, upon receiving it, the stated clerk kind of has to decide which committee it goes to. And so what really excites me is that this overture is not only going to be considered by the Overtures Committee at General Assembly in June, but was also referred to all of the national agencies, committees, et cetera.
Give a couple of examples of what these agencies are. And these committees.
Sure. So there's so RUF is the campus ministry of our denomination. That's a committee agency. Geneva Benefits, which manages our retirement as well as some of our benefits. Actually, Covenant College, Covenant Seminary, they are both committee. They are both agencies, so to speak, of our denomination, and there's a handful more. MTW, Mission to the World, so there's a handful more.
Okay. So you took this to the presbytery. The presbytery voted majority for it to go all the way up to the General Assembly. If it passes there, it is asking people to look into Bitcoin.
That's correct.
It's not requiring them to do anything. It's not demanding that they do anything.
That's right.
Tell us about why you, as a pastor and a church planter and a campus minister who have been ordained and called towards the ministry of preaching and of sacrament, why do you care about Bitcoin? Why do you think a church should care about it? Why should a denomination care about it? What drove you to this? Yeah,
so there's a couple of different factors that contributed to a moment of kind of a decisive pivot towards Bitcoin. There's a couple of factors. One is my childhood growing up. As with a lot of people, money was a thing. Money was tight. And so even then, money was seen as kind of the escape out of a particular life or world. And, you know, honestly, that still is something that the Lord brings to my attention and calls me to trust him. Another factor is, my having grown up that way, I wanted, and becoming a Christian in college, I wanted to be a good steward of the resources, however little it was. A funny story, back when I was a kid, my mother, she had marshmallow cream jars and empty ones, and she cut a hole in each top of each one, and it was 10% tithes, 10% savings, and she just life savings. She called it life savings. She's like, no question, like, you do this. And so it's kind of ingrained in me. So, Beth and I got married soon after I became a Christian, and I wanted to be a good steward. I wanted to be not only a good steward, I wanted to be wise with money. And so things like eschewing debt and saving and those sorts of things were just a part of it. And kind of track along now, 25 years later, saved in retirement and have saved in retirement and those sorts of things, and really appreciate financial advisors who seek to help us, especially us pastors with Geneva, to do that. But looking at some of my investments and realizing they're doing okay, but looking at a little bit of inflation data and starting to ask questions and realizing that something's not right here. And about that same time, something's not right here with the amount of money printing that's gone on since 2008, since 2020, and how those numbers are just not going to line up very well. And around that same time, one of my wife's good friends that she grew up with, a man I respect greatly, successful businessman, actually a state representative in the state of Mississippi, had been talking about Bitcoin almost every day on his Facebook page. And so I ran across it, and I started listening to some of it, and I thought, this might be something that I want to look at. I trust this guy, respect this guy a ton. And that began a pretty quick journey into the types of questions about the nature of money and the property of money and the history of money and all of those things. And I began reading a lot, and then pretty soon pivoted pretty decisively into Bitcoin. So that's my personal journey. And then continue to learn over the last year to this moment where, and especially when BlackRock categorized in their paper last fall Bitcoin as a risk-off asset, I thought maybe this is something that could benefit church balance sheets, Presbytery balance sheets. And
could you briefly explain what risk-off means?
Risk-off, so for a long time, Bitcoin was considered a risk-on asset. There's other risk-on assets like, highly leveraged, financial products that are kind of risk-on. Risk-off for somebody might be like gold. It's like it's
a way of protecting yourself against
it's a
chaotic events.
Correct, exactly, yes. And BlackRock actually categorizing it as a risk-off, I think, was a substantial thing in the TradFi world. And so I was just putting those things together and going, let's shoot this. We're a grassroots denomination. I love that about us. Somebody has an idea, we send it through the system and get input. It might get shot down, might get voted up, whatever. So
right. And Bitcoin began, and it continues to be mainly a grassroots driven phenomenon and invention.
Right. That's right.
There are some top-down type things happening now with it in terms of nations and companies and financial institutions recognizing the importance of this and the innovation of it. But it is mainly, like the PCA, a grassroots phenomenon.
Yes.
Someone might hear what you're saying and they'll say, Ben, that's great for you. Glad you've figured out some way to try to make it to retirement, although maybe they don't agree with you or they think you're a little bit crazy. They might say, that's good for you. Why should that translate into churches and the church and even a denomination taking this seriously also, beyond just an individual working out their own financial plan?
Well, there's kind of two aspects of that for me. There's the theological aspect and the practical aspect. On the theological piece, I come from a worldview, a kind of an all-encompassing worldview that everything belongs to Jesus. The Lord wants us to bring everything that is going on in our lives before Him. There's nothing that's less important to Him about whatever's going on in our lives and in His bride, the church. And so I kind of just start there from a theological point of view. Plus, Jesus talks a lot about money, but pertinent to kind of my story is I've been in ordained ministry for almost 21 years, and fundraising has been a part of my calling since day one of ministry. And I was encouraged early on in my journey to realize that, like, hey, this is something Paul did. Paul, as he's planting churches, as he's helping ministries connect with one another, as he's trying to make sure that those churches are well resourced, they just had to talk about money. And so that kind of brings me into the practical side of, like, money is just something that not only is not off limits, but I think actually something we can bring before the Lord and say, Lord, we'd like to do these types of ministries. We would like to pay a pastor. Here's what we got. How can we steward this well? So that's kind of my answer to that.
Right. And so, the main kind of innovation behind Bitcoin is that it is a digital form of money with a limited supply that no one is in charge of, so that you don't have to worry about somebody taking control of it and increasing the supply so that it gets inflated away, as has happened over and over and over again in history all over the world, going back thousands of years. What are some ways that you have seen in your own ministry, or ways that you're hearing about from other people? How does something like inflation and monetary debasement, how does it affect ministry and the churches?
Yeah, so some of the ways that I've seen inflation impact ministries is how inflation has impacted the families that give, the people that give. They are working very hard. They want to be generous. They love the church. They love the ministry of the church. And the price of things has gone up, and that has impacted the giving, the ministry that the church wants to do. Wages have not paced right with that inflation, for example, and so those are some of those aspects.
Right, and you've mentioned before that churches can have lots of ideas and ministries has lots of ideas, but a lot of times it comes down to how we're going to pay for it.
Yeah, and I want the church and our church to dream about the ministry that we would love to do, but at the same time, it's like, how are we going to pay for it? That's just a conversation. So it's a practical sense of, like, we're going to talk about it.
So, you can do fundraising. It's great. Why should the church be investing, though?
Yeah, so I think the nature of what I'm asking in this overture, or more properly what the Presbytery, South Texas Presbytery is asking, is to consider pivoting into sounder money as a savings program. So for me, it's less about the investment piece of it. It's more about where is a better spot for some long-term savings for our resources. And so that's what, when I began to study the properties, the history of money, the properties of fiat, properties of Bitcoin, properties of gold, all of it, I'm like, I think this could be a good spot for a savings for a corporate balance sheet, but also like a strategic fund, for a church. So
to be clear, we're not trying to ask the church to get rich quick. We're just trying to stop the bleeding. You're doing all this fundraising effort and then putting the money into an account that's like a melting ice cube.
Yes, my thinking in this is let's put the money into what could be a stronger spot than what we know to be true, which is an inflated currency, with the idea that you'll hold it because Bitcoin is volatile. No, everyone knows that Bitcoin is volatile, but for a long enough holding period, you will have at least retained the value that you put into it, if not had increased. But just treat it as a savings account.
So we're not talking about operating expenses that we need next month.
That's right.
Time horizons. What kind of time horizons are you focused on?
Well, my opinion is 4 to 5 years. Who knows if the cycles are over or whatever, but the volatility is going to continue, in my opinion. So I just kind of go with I would recommend holding 4 to 5. Now, the beautiful thing about this overture is that churches, presbyteries, they can study for themselves and say, hey, no, we want to do 10-year, or we want to do 3. We have this strategic plan, et cetera, et cetera. They can figure out their own risk profile and build according to that risk profile that they want. But for me, at least even in my person, I'm like, it's a 5-year hold. So
churches and ministries tend to be pretty cautious, and they tend to move slowly. And there's some really good things about that, and there's good reasons for that. Something like volatility is something that could be really dangerous to a church or to a ministry, or it could be something so scary that they don't even want to get close to it. What would you say to a church that says, look, this is an interesting idea. I can see the problem with inflation and all these things that are going on around us, but we just can't afford to go up and down the way that Bitcoin historically has done. What would you say to them? Again,
I think that's where getting to your own understanding of what your risk profile is, and it might include no Bitcoin for us. Totally fine, but arrive at what you believe a good risk profile is for you. Arrive at a conviction, but in that case, I mean, even if you could put $100 a month, you actually catch the ups and the downs and the volatility with the idea that you're going to hold. I think you could come out pretty good. So that's just like a practical thing, I would say.
Right. Many churches, if they have 6 months of operating expenses saved up, they're doing pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
You're talking about multiple years down the road, money that you can touch. What would you say to a church that says, look, we don't even have the kind of cushion, anywhere close to the kind of cushion you're talking about?
I think you can run them in parallel. You set your operations, you set your daily checking account, and then you say, hey, maybe we can set aside a strategic reserve, for example, as a savings account and Bitcoin, and just dollar cost average when you can, and then at that point, after 4 or 5 years, if it's grown and those sorts of things, then the playbook is wide open on what kind of ministries you want to expand into. So that's kind of how I would think about it.
We've been talking a lot about the downsides of a financial system that has inflation baked into the cake and very much outside of your control. Positively, what are some good things that could happen if a church is able to save money for the future and expect reasonably that the value of it will go up? What could happen for a church or for a ministry if they're able to reliably save for the future? Yeah,
I mean, you could plant more churches. You could send missionaries. You could expand your local ministry partnerships that you have. You can embolden those. You can, again, I think I love to dream big, way too big, but I just love to dream big. And at that point, for me, it's like, the playbook's open, right. And so what that means is I'm saying consider thinking about this. If you believe it to be a sounder monetary setup for you, then this could be a good way to save some dollars towards those big dreams of ministry.
I heard somebody say one time that church budgets are often treated as a necessary evil. It's a number that we throw out there that if we hit the number, great. We don't have to think about it anymore. That's all we care about. And the guy said, no, really, a budget is an expression of your vision for good and for bad. And that it's something that is aspirational and not unreasonable, but it's a way of expressing in numerical form, this is what we think God's called us to do, and this is what we want to do.
That's right.
And savings could be part of that.
That's correct.
Down the road.
Yes.
What would you say to somebody, I've heard many people, you've heard some of it too, someone who says, why are we talking about this? You're a pastor. We're a church. We should just be focused on spiritual things. We should be focused on heaven. We should be focused on preaching the gospel. What would you say to somebody who says that this is something we shouldn't even be considering? Maybe it's good for families or businesses, but we're a church.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is I would completely agree that our primary focus is the propagation of the word and discipleship and, preaching the word and those sorts of things. Absolutely, that is our primary focus. There's a little bit of a dichotomy there, though, to operationally how that works. And I kind of refer back to my earlier statement of like, it all belongs to Jesus. And I think we're free to entertain and look at and study anything that we believe could benefit that overall ministry of the gospel in the Word. And so that's kind of my response. Again, for me, practically, being a fundraiser and planting churches, and that just became a kind of a daily thing to think about, to pray through.
Right, and this is not just some modern American thing of churches getting wrapped up with money. You see examples through Scripture of the reality that God's people use money.
That's
and
right.
Have to raise money.
Yes. So there's no dichotomy there for me. There's priority for sure. Well, I trust that the Lord is going to continue to bring about His kingdom and His ways without hindrance, and we're going to continue to receive and study and learn how He might want us to move into the work that He is already doing. God is at work, and how can we tuck in behind God and His work, and how does that relate to ministry, and how do we pay for that?
Right. And Jim, you're a deacon, and in our world, we have deacons called to deal primarily with issues around the body, money, property, fostering generosity, these kinds of things, so that the elders can focus more on spiritual shepherding, preaching, sacraments, those kinds of things. But our church constitution says that if a church doesn't have deacons, it's not that you say, we can't focus on physical things. We can't focus on caring for the poor. We can't worry about money. It says, no, it's the job of the elders now to do it. This is something that's so important and so central to the ministry of the church, to care for the body and to think about issues of stewardship and generosity, that it, in an indirect way, it's a very earthy physical thing, but it becomes a spiritual calling.
Yes, I agree.
Some people hear the famous warnings in the Bible against the love of money, and there are many warnings about it. Jesus warns about you can't choose between God and mammon, almost like money is a kind of personal force that will grab hold of you. And as pastors, you do see how money grabs hold of a lot of people in a very dark way. We hear from Paul that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. What would you say to somebody who says, we don't need to be talking about this, it's kind of a dangerous thing to be dealing with, and talking about money is kind of inherently wrong or kind of evil, and it's just something we have to deal with? What would you say to them as they hear us talking about churches considering something like Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think a couple of notes on that. I think, again, there's the theological approach there that one of the most influential books that I read early on was a book called Creation Regained by Al Walters. And he talks about a concept called structure and direction, and basically how things are ontologically good. It's the direction that we take those things that God has entrusted to us, where the sin gets attached. So it's not that money is evil; it's that the love of money it has the potential to take over. And I absolutely agree with those warnings. I think the second thing I would say is, like, just in my own personal journey with money, because of the way my childhood and even moving through ministry, I continually ask the Lord. I know my heart, and so I ask the Lord, and I trust Him to protect my heart. And as doing that, I have a sense of freedom to actually ask the question of, like, what do we do with this? We have this good thing called money. Let's steward it towards the things that the Lord wants us to do. So I think that question implies a little bit of a sacred-secular dichotomy that our framework would kind of soundly reject.
Explain what you mean. Explain what that dichotomy is and what's wrong with it
so
biblically.
again, just going back to all of life belongs to the Lord. All of my time, all of my energy, not only Sundays, but Monday through Saturday. There's nothing inherently dirty, right? It's that as stewards of that and as sinners, we bend that resource in a direction, and we're not faithful to it. That's the problem. The problem is not the thing. And so, again, that's that sacred secular dichotomy of like, there's this thing that we do that's holy, and then there's these things that we do. And I just think it's ill-informed. I mean, people just have those kind of gaps, and
Right.
I'd love to help people understand those
Right.
things.
It infects a lot of Christianity, but there's this deep sense in our broader society that spiritual things have nothing to do with real things.
Yeah,
or
I
with
mean, if you
earthly
really
things.
want to get into it, I mean, this is part of what's underlying Paul's rebuke of the Corinthians, an over-realized or under-realized eschatology that led them to believe that the body didn't really matter.
Right.
And he's like, no, it all matters.
Right.
So,
Right, yeah, you have people in the Corinthian church who are kind of taking that both ways.
Correct.
Of stay away from it or just go for it.
Exactly.
Whole hog.
Exactly.
And people can do the same thing with money.
that's right.
Right? You
That's
just
right.
totally stay away from it or, who cares?
So
Just
maybe
go
an
for it.
example of this, I was around some Christians about a year ago, wonderful Christian people, and they were just like, I think it's amazing that God only requires us to give him 10% of our money, and the other 90% we can do what we want. And I said, 100% of your money belongs to the Lord.
Right.
10 is like a guided, helpful kind of thing, but like it all belongs to the Lord. He wants you to be faithful, even if you're eating a hamburger at McDonald's, or you're grilling a steak, or taking your family on vacation, or buying groceries. It all belongs to him. So
Right,
that's
but-
just pushing against that sacred secular.
Some people might push back, though, and say, well, that's true as far as it goes with individual Christians.
Yeah.
That, everything in their life, is for God, and they should do everything for God, and they should think about how to apply it all. But the church is not the same thing as a business, or the church is not the same thing as a family. The church is not called to the same things that every individual Christian is called to. What would you say if they then said, fine, in your own life, think about finances. Businesses can think about finances and investment, but we're just going to preach the gospel.
Right. I still say, number one, agree, preach the gospel. Number two, it has something to do with money. I kind of get real practical real fast. I mean, there's the earlier mention of the theological piece of it. But I think it's just wise for us to study it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes about how we have Paul's letter to the Romans, this amazing theological reflection about the nature of the gospel and what God's given us in Christ. And you can sometimes kind of forget that what it really is a fundraising letter, is that he's preparing the Romans for him to come and get a bunch of money from them so that he can do a missions trip to Spain.
Yes.
And it's like, Paul didn't do that just because he loves money or because he thinks the main point of his ministry is to get money. No, of course not. The money is a means to an end. And people go sideways when they make money the end. But that doesn't mean that money is not a means. And churches can't avoid that either, and ministries can't avoid that. And they're experiencing the pain of bad money and broken money in all kinds of ways. What would you say as far as the side of things of the call of churches and of pastors to disciple people in their individual lives and individual callings? What does money have to do with discipleship?
Well, again, I would love for believers to engage the Lord on every single aspect of their lives. He is deeply interested in every aspect of our lives. He's deeply invested. See, there's that financial term. He's deeply invested in us. He made a payment. See, so we already have some of this language that. So my point there is, I think a shepherding moment for a congregant, for example, for me has been let's cover all the bases. So I actually I call my people ahead and be like, hey, I'd love to come by and check on y'all, visit with you. I'm just going to come out of the gate. Here's what we're going to talk about, and it's every aspect, because I'm trying to communicate there is like the Lord's calling us to be faithful in all those things.
Right, and there's an understandable wariness for people to hear church leaders talking about money because that's been abused
Yes.
so badly.
Totally.
But in my experience, most of the pastors I know, including myself, have tended to talk about money too little rather than too much.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I, out of necessity, didn't have that. Like I because of the fundraising piece.
Right.
So for me, over the last 21 years, it's how have I done that? Not whether or not I've done that, because I have done it, but how do I talk about money? How do I talk about what giving to the kingdom looks like? How do I talk about the ministries that we would love to do? And these are the funds that are required.
Right.
For me, it's been more about the how than the squeamishness of talking about money. I just haven't had a choice, and that's okay. That's my calling. I'm fine with that.
Good for you.
Yeah.
You're better than me.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
Someone might be hearing and they're tracking along. They're saying, okay, yeah, money's an important part of life in this world. They'll even acknowledge that churches need to deal with money and ideally should be able to save money for the future. They'll agree that Christians should be good stewards of the resources God's given them. But why Bitcoin? What does Bitcoin have to do with any of this? Can you explain briefly how Bitcoin fosters those things?
Yeah. So for me, it is the properties of the asset, the asset itself. And so really a part of my journey was studying the history of money. And like I didn't even know that its three main things were store of value, medium of exchange, unit of account.
This is what makes money money.
That's what makes money money. And so, and then, you get into, well, now how have we exchanged that value between one another? What are some ways that, economic ways that that's worked well? What are some ways in which that's been not done well? And so, for me, as it kind of was a process of elimination, right? Of like where can I put the value that is stored up through my work, for example, through our congregants' work, if you want to say, where can we put that? And what are the properties of that particular asset that make it more sound or less sound? And through that process of elimination, for me, it was like, there's some good ones, but like this is the best one technically that I can find.
So you've said that phrase now several times, sound money. Could you dig in a little bit on that?
Sound money, like for me, just think about it, it's like it's trustworthy. So it's like, I don't know, like right now the situation is, what is the value of the money going to be today? What is it going to be tomorrow? So there's a trust piece, whereas like if you're an engineer, there's an illustration. If you're an engineer and he's got to build a bridge, a foot is a foot is a foot. I've actually met the timekeeper of the world. He lives in Colorado. He's the one that sets the time clock. Anyway, so you got those measurements. So when I talk about sound, that's one piece of it I'm talking about. And that is the fixed supply of Bitcoin.
I think a lot of people would think of the dollar as sound, at least relative to other currencies like Argentinian pesos.
Yes.
Right.
It is.
But even within America, depending on what generation you're in, you might have a completely different experience, right?
Yes, and I do think that has a lot to do with the last 4 years and the money supply that's gone up. If you were priced into assets that increase in dollars before that point in time, if you had those assets
like houses,
real estate, stocks, bonds, you're doing okay. But because the money supply is cranked up so much, it's much harder for millennials and below, honestly, to get into those assets in the first place, and therefore they're going to miss that hedge against inflation, whether it be property or.
So everybody kind of like intuitively knows that we need to hedge against inflation.
Yes.
And the ways that people have done that are through stocks or real estate.
Yes.
But then the flip side of that is, if you're a baby boomer and you're putting all your wealth into real estate, then millennials are priced out of housing.
That's right.
Yeah.
You're seeing this in your own church and ministry, the way it's affecting people?
Yeah, I have my church. I'm one of the oldest in my church. I'm 47. I'm one of the oldest. I've got a ton of young families with debt, some with debt, but then also just not at a wage point to get into both spouses working. They're not at a point to where they can get into a house. And so I've seen an increase in that struggle. I feel like I kind of snuck in, bought my first house in 2004. I feel like I kind of snuck in. But generations below, they're working hard too. That's the one message I would maybe say. It's just like, as I look as a pastor, these folks are working really hard. They're seeking to be good stewards. They're seeking to be faithful to the church and good stewards of their money, and it's just not going as far.
Yeah, like in the secular world, people would just say, well, we have to have two incomes. My wife has to work. Maybe in the church world, it would be wearing it as a badge of honor that you're going to work until the day that you die for the Lord, right?
Yeah, so that's the other piece of it for me, is as I've interacted with many of my friends around my station of ministry, it's like, I'm like, I think that there's a 62, 65-year-old retirement. Again, we all want to do ministry until for the rest of our lives, but there's just going to be needs for us, our families.
A lot of pastors who are really stressed right now.
Yeah,
older,
exactly. Yes.
Can I even retire at all?
Right, correct. And I'm saying, well, let's separate the two. Like, retire, I want to preach the gospel forever, but let's separate that from, being able to do the things that are going to be happening as we get older, right? So,
how do you help encourage people who don't see the problem, don't see the urgency of dealing with this, who maybe want to kind of look down on younger people who are complaining about it? Oh, you don't work hard enough, or you're a snowflake. How do you help them?
I would just say we're saved by grace, and everything we receive from God is by His gift and His grace. If you say, I worked really hard and they need to work hard, I'd say, well, hey, look, we're all a family here, the family of God, and we're all the work that you were able to do is God's grace. So I just start with the gospel of grace, and therefore, once you start there, I think that will lead you to more of a seeking to understand the financial struggles that are going on today, and that's kind of pastorally how I handle that.
How do you help the younger people who might be tempted to be resentful or angry towards people who have more than they do, or feel really despairing?
Yeah, again, I think it's. I think for that situation is like the Lord has drawn pleasant lines for me, and I don't know those stories of the wealth behind those people, and I would love to, but I know that contempt in my heart is not good, and so
right.
Humility, understanding the gospel of grace and approaching with humility.
Right.
Is going to at least get you in a good direction.
Right. And one of the beautiful things about the church is that it is a spread of generations of people learning from each other, and the young honoring the old. But as you kind of think even bigger picture of, we've been talking about kind of the haves and the have not so much in the American church, but relatively speaking, the American church and the American financial system is pretty good in terms of financial material resources compared to the rest of the world. How does something like Bitcoin help American churches to be better stewards of their wealth with regards to what's going on in other countries and being able to be more generous in that way?
Yeah, I just think there's opportunity there. I think for me, like on the Overture, for example, studying Bitcoin is going to raise a number of other questions in good ways about what do we want our ministry to look like here and abroad, those sorts of things. And I think the playbook is wide open on those. In those scenarios. Right.
We've been talking mainly about Bitcoin designed to limit inflation or to protect yourself from it. Can you talk a little bit, thinking in terms of missions and other places in the world where maybe there's more persecution of Christians or financial repression? How does Bitcoin help Christians and churches in those countries that don't have the problems that we do, or they have very different problems than we do?
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of good stories out there about Bitcoin as a medium of exchange that's already being done in those countries, and enabled people to exchange that value that they know is true. Right, the Bitcoin, it's the truth value that's exchanged. That have enabled them to continue doing their ministry, especially if their fiat currency is inflating like crazy against the fiat dollar.
Right. And, we kind of take it for granted in America that everyone is connected to banks and has bank accounts, and it's not that hard for most people in America to figure that out or to access it. But that's not the case for some people in America, but a lot of people in the world.
That's right. Yeah.
And the Bitcoin as a way for people to themselves save money and send money.
That's
and
right.
To receive money too. One of the big challenges in missions, especially in the developing world and more repressive parts of the world, is how do you actually get funds to churches?
Yeah, there's more people with mobile phones in the world than bank accounts.
Right. And this is something, there are good sound things about gold as money. It's why people used it and preferred it as sound money for thousands of years. But this is one area where Bitcoin really shines. It's
correct. The medium of exchange, the way in which you can have a verified transaction in 10 minutes.
It's easy and it's fast and it's cheap to send it, which is not true of something like gold or stocks or real estate, certainly.
I was just going to say, historically, the crypto space, which Bitcoin is part of, we would say Bitcoin, not crypto, but it is part of the crypto space, has been rife with speculators, kind of gambler type behavior, getting rich quick. How is it like, how do you view the church's responsibility here in terms of being the moral and ethical voice for how Christians in congregations should approach this asset?
Yeah, I think there's some really good resources there with regard to the nature of money and the way that the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, talk about improper weights and balances and those sorts of things. And when you study the properties of any given money, I think Bitcoin very heavily leans into that more sound moral money. It cannot be inflated. There's transactions are verified. I have the entire Bitcoin transaction history on a little box at my house. So
again, just going back to, we're talking about saving, not speculation.
Yeah. So yeah,
it's the same asset, right? So it's really about what's in your heart.
It is, yes, and but yeah. So I think that's. Again, the conviction comes is by process of elimination, what could be a great place to put some value and therefore save, right? That, people say your Bitcoin is how do they say it? Future money, or it's the only money that can be sent to the future, right? Because if you sit on it, it's sent to the future, and it's going to be the same amount of what it was today because it can't be inflated.
I guess most people just probably wouldn't associate Bitcoin with the non-risky savings vehicle. They would think bonds, maybe real estate, gold, something like that.
I think lately those types of questions are getting jumbled up. Bond and what markets are doing. I'm not an economist. I'm not a financial advisor or any of those things. I'm just reading the headlines of many different sources and being like, the financial picture right now, everybody's like, what's happening?
Right.
The idea, though, is that even if you think Bitcoin is actually one thing, your message is study it, and you may come to find out that it is actually sound money. It's
Correct.
not just like tulips.
Yes,
tulip mania.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and there's an element, too, of the leadership of the church being called to be good examples to the congregation, both in their not loving of money is one of the qualifications for an elder, but also positively of being a good manager of his own household, which includes economic management and concern. Paul warns the whole church in 1 Timothy about Christians who refuse to take care of their own family members, and he says, you're worse than a non-believer. If that's true of all Christians, it's certainly true of the leadership of the church. But also leaders do function as stewards of the church's resources and of its future. And we have a long time horizon backwards and forwards of what God is doing in the world and of his kingdom and as it spreads. And we do want to be concerned for faithfully passing on something to the future generations of good stewardship of our wealth, just like we've received from our ancestors going back 2,000 years of ways that they did the best they could to preserve their resources theologically and materially and spiritually so that we could benefit from it.
Yes. I mean, there's so much financial language in those scriptures about, we have an imperishable inheritance. We have the gospel. We want to make those deposits as Paul made those good deposits of the gospel in Timothy, all that sort of language that helps us understand. Now, of course, that's the primary legacy that we want to leave our children, our children's children. It is interesting that the Bible uses those sorts of metaphors.
Right. It's almost something kind of baked into human society.
Yes.
Reality.
Yes.
And that's a lot of, I think, why the Bible does have so many warnings about money is because it does touch on so many aspects of our lives, and it's so central to it.
Yes.
That it's a wonderful thing. It's an amazing thing, really, when you start digging into what it is and how well it works. But the flip side of something being great is that it can become extremely dangerous and dark because it can grab hold of your heart so easily. You were just talking about the imperishable inheritance, unfading crown of glory that Christians have stored up for us in heaven. C.S. Lewis has that famous essay where he talks about how people in the modern world think that if you're focused on heaven, you're not going to care about earth and you're going to be a really bad earthly citizen. He says, no, actually, it's the opposite. To the extent that you are focused on heaven, you become a better earthly citizen. And he cites all these different reformers through church history who ended slavery, who campaigned at great personal expense to change earthly realities. What would you say to somebody who says, let's just focus on heaven? Why does Bitcoin have anything to do? Why does financial stewardship have anything to do with living for heaven?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I mean, for me, it's the realization of the certainty of the promise being fulfilled in Jesus, of the reality that awaits all of us, actually frees me up to ask this question, Lord. All right, Lord, what do you want me to do in the meantime?
Right.
And then you have the whole New Testament of everything he's calling us to do, and you jump in the game and you trust him and you lean on him. And so the more, I agree with Lewis, the more you drill down on and the more you live out of the confidence of what you have coming, completely frees you up to dive into the ministry of the gospel. But I also would say frees you up to be open-minded about something innovative like Bitcoin, right? It didn't just come out of nowhere, right? Here it is. So it might be worth studying and whatever conclusion you draw about it.
So as Westerners, especially in the United States, living on the U.S. dollar, world reserve currency, I think it's just really easy for us to take it for granted. You were talking about we're well-banked. We have all these financial privileges, access to institutions, ability to buy stocks in the stock market. There's billions of people around the world that don't have this. And even worse, they live in countries where they're having actual hyperinflation. And in those cases, those people, it's very intuitive to them that they would love to open an account that's denominated in dollars. So, yeah, on a day-to-day basis, they may be, medium of exchange with Argentinian pesos, but they love to save in dollars. It's totally intuitive to them. And so it can just be hard for us to realize that, but it's the same corollary, right? Like we might be exchanging in dollars, but our savings account's denominated in Bitcoin, right? So I think that's something to keep in view here is just the level of privilege that we all live under, right?
Totally.
And it's the air we breathe. It's the culture we live in because we're literally sitting at the top of the heap right now. And so,
I totally agree.
Yeah. Do you have any encouragement?
Yeah,
to anybody?
no, I just think that perspective is very, very important from a humility point of view. Again, if we really believe the gospel of grace and that all of life is a gift from the Lord, then our hearts are going to ache, not only for people to walk and know with Jesus, but the conditions they're living in, those sorts of things. It's going to promote an attitude of seeking to understand the struggles that people have in other contexts in this world. I think that's, I think that's very important.
Well, there's a side of it too where it's like we should be grateful that we are as comfortable as we are, and that the Lord has been so kind to us as He has been, even though we don't deserve it. He has entrusted a lot to America and Americans and American churches. But the flip side of that, as Jesus teaches, is that to whom much is given, much is expected.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And just because things have worked out well for you in your life or your country doesn't mean I don't have to think about this. What is God calling me to?
Yes.
All right. So Ben, in closing, remind us again, why should we care about this overture? What's your hope for it? Why should people listen?
Yeah. So I think elders, sessions, presbyteries in our denomination deeply care about doing ministry, the ministry that we believe God has called us to do, and part of that is the financial piece. And so I would love for just these organizations and us to ask these questions of the stewardship and what could be an opportunity in something like Bitcoin as a small piece of a savings plan, and that's really it. That's the nature of it, is to put it on the radar as something it could be worth looking at, could be worth studying, even just for a few hours. Referring, I'll shameless plug for y'all. I mean, with your organization as a nonprofit foundation whose sole mission is to educate churches on Bitcoin, and so encourage these sessions to watch some of y'all's videos, to call you, to reach out to you. That would be what I would love to see happen. Any of that happening from any of these places would be wonderful.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today, Ben.
Thanks.
Really glad you could be here, and we are praying for the denomination as it considers these weighty matters for the sake of its mission.
Thank you all so much.